conventional wisdom has been that crime, especially homicide, has been on the rise since the end of the pandemic. Remember how New York's governor sent the National Guard to protect the city's subway system and its riders? But now there's a study showing a very different picture. Datalytics says that homicides have dropped in many major cities over the past year. They're down 82% in Boston, 58% in Columbus, Ohio, and 40% in Las Vegas.
The data shows homicides declined 35% in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and 32% in Detroit. Here in D.C., crime has fallen 2 months in a row. Homicides are down 31% and violent crime is down 10% compared to this time last year. So what is at play?
So this is very interesting, and it's good news, and we should, celebrate good news when it takes place. There was a spike in crime in many cities toward the end of the pandemic, and that is now receding in many places, including in the nation's capital, where we are here. We've been complaining about massive rises in crime last year, but homicide is getting better. Now, in some of these places, I think property crime has also fallen in some of the places, according to the Wall Street Journal, in San Francisco, which was plagued with a lot of property crime. It's coming down there too. So anyway, this seems to be some good news.
Yeah, I mean, we covered recently on the show the viral interview between frequent rising guest Olayemi Olurin and Mayor Eric Adams of New York. And one of the more contentious points in that debate that they had on the Breakfast Club with Charlamagne the God was around the question of whether or not police officers, municipal leaders, those who generally speaking want to argue for more funding for police departments especially over other budget priorities like library funding, which was recently cut in New York, use fear-mongering around crime to do so. At the same time that to look good and effective as leaders in the criminal justice space, they have an investment in talking about how crime has actually come down under their watch. And when Olayemi pointed this out, that even though he had just tweeted like a day or so before their interview, before their debate, that crime was down in New York, he still supported efforts like Kathy Hochul calling on the National Guard for the optics of making people feel more safe, because it simultaneously has the effect of making people feel like this sort of thing is necessary, that they need to have a visible police presence in the subway, even though there's so many instances of people catching the police, milling around, not doing anything, not having higher rates of actually solving crimes or catching perpetrators of crimes. It's simply performative safety theater, safetyism, if you will, on a huge scale and at the expense of millions of taxpayer dollars. And she caught Eric Adams because he had to either admit that his own administration of funds to get policing under control in New York wasn't working and that crime was up, or he has to say, well, I did do a good job and crime is down, so I'm not justified in calling for more and more money for the police department. And so you can see how these narratives are frequently exploited because people want to feel safe, and you can take any instance in a metropolitan area where obviously crime happens, there's millions and millions of people living in these places, and make it seem like that's a pattern, that's a trend, it's something that people should be concerned of. And you can look into the world and see poverty and have your priors confirmed. But the question is, in light of this news, is the public going to be more resistant to being scared, frankly, into allowing their tax dollars to go disproportionately to policing as opposed to education and other resources that their families can enjoy?
Well, I mean, I don't know. We'd have to look city by city at what went into bringing crime down. I mean, if some of these cities spent more money on policing or sent police to do more patrolling in crime-prone neighborhoods or on public transportation, and then it resulted in crime going down, I mean, just regardless of what they say, probably the people will see that as a win for policing. They'll probably want to fund police more.
Well, the homicide issue isn't a subway issue. And I think the fact that there was a focus on safety on the subway is really instructive, right? People who are victims of homicide overwhelmingly are lower income in places like New York City. And yet the focus of how to make the public feel safe was on attending to the concerns of the average middle-class commuter who feels like, yes, the presence of people who are panhandling or obviously impoverished, unhomed, et cetera, in the subway.
Mentally ill and saying deranged things and threatening people.
That's fine. But instead of, if you really care about homicides, then the the priority would not be putting National Guards performatively in a subway system to do bag checks where the homicides aren't happening. It would be actually putting resources to getting to the root of what's going on there, whether it's gang activity, what affects gang recruitment. Is it poverty? Is it horrible things going on in schools where people aren't feeling like they're even safe attending school on a regular basis? All of those kinds of things that are very much rooted to the social fabric and the social safety work. We've seen these crime trends over the course of years be so superficially affected by police funding and overwhelmingly affected by things like temperature changes, overall economic changes, whether or not we got lead out of paint in the water. So at what point are we going to realize that you can't just browbeat and fearmonger into having safer communities? That if we're going to live as a community in these cities that have millions and millions of people in them, you have to take care of people cradle to grave, or else you're going to get these bad outcomes.
I mean, the argument I am hearing from many people on social media, and I'm not saying I necessarily agree with this argument, but what people are saying is that following George Floyd and the protests, police responded to that by pulling back and not policing as aggressively, and then there was a massive crime spike, and now that trend has kind of reverted, that has worked itself out now, and they're policing again, and now crime has come down. That's what people are saying.
So following George Floyd being murdered by police officers on camera, there was an analysis of 109 city budgets across the country. Only 8 agencies cut police funds by more than 2%, while 91 agencies out of 109 increased law enforcement funding by at least 2%. In 49 cities or counties, police funding actually increased by more than 10%. So again, this is a great point that Ole brought up during that debate, and I strongly encourage everybody to listen to her content and to that debate in particular, because she's very informed on these sorts of issues. The point which she was making is that despite trends that show that we have doubled down on the idea of throwing money at cops in the wake of George Floyd, if there's ever a city that has an increased crime rate following this kind of a tough on crime initiative, no matter what, it still is blamed. Higher crime is always blamed on the existence somewhere of a progressive prosecutor or the existence somewhere of some policy, bail reform policy or the like, despite the overwhelming thrust of the policy shift and the following George Floyd being conservative in nature, tougher on crime. And given the conversation that we just had about the factors that affect the crime rate having so very little to do with actual police funding, why are we still being convinced that this is where our tax dollars need to go? Not to mention that there are these horrible abuses by the police department, which result in them having to pay out millions of dollars to families that again are paid for by the tax dollars. And we say you should have qualified immunity. You shouldn't be personally responsible for ending people's lives, shooting kids with toy guns, all of the kinds of cases that we see coming across the news transom that courts adjudicate and decide that these officers are guilty. But who actually picks up the slack? And why are we constantly in these situations where many of the police officers that are written up again and again for this kind of behavior are returned to the streets? Isn't that at least as concerning, returning cops who we know have performed poorly or broken the law back to their beats, as is the question of whether or not bail reform is letting people who have conducted crimes who aren't police officers back onto the street over and over again? If you care about the latter, why wouldn't you care about the former at least as much? Because we're the ones that are bailing out those police officers.
Well, I just think it's important to share real data, real trends. People talk about crime like it's always going up, so when there's good news, we should share that as well. More Rising right after this.